Good morning. By my watch, we've got 3 or 4 minutes to go, but we only have 2 chairs. We only have 1 chair. So I think we'll start. I want to do one thing to start this morning, and that is to ask, just by show of hands, how many of you have not seen the so-called rules of engagement?
Seen what?
Rules of engagement.
He handed them out about 3 weeks ago.
So what I may do is just send them out to everyone again, and if you've seen them, that's not going to be the end of your life. You can read them again.
Over there.
The suggestion for this morning's order of business is to start with an update from Carol Lee on the state of the President's nominations and their approval or lack thereof. Then we're going to go to the sort of difficult topic for a while of debt deficit spending and the various sides of it, and then end with the discussion of biases and trying to persuade others. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Carol Lee, it's your turn.
Okay. Can I rip it down? Yeah, I need that.
You may.
Thank you. I need my stand. All right.
Good morning. I want to bring everybody up to date on the confirmations if you have not been following it or you have been following it. Not a lot has been accomplished because, of course, there's so many other things going on. But the Deb Haaland is still in the throes of waiting, but it looks like she will be confirmed as the Secretary of Interior. And I'll tell you the ones who have been confirmed already. Becerra is under question. Because he was the Attorney General in California, and people have a lot of objections to him. But it looks like he probably will be confirmed. And Neera Tanden, if you have been following that, has withdrawn her application. She has asked to be withdrawn because Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat, has objected to her, mainly to her tweets. And there's a lot of controversy about that because people feel it's because she's a woman. And he confirmed many of Trump's appointees who had many worse tweets. But he objects to her, and there is no Republican who will take his place, so they won't have a majority. Gina Raimondo, who was the governor of Rhode Island, has been confirmed as Secretary of Commerce. And she will be landing in the middle of several international trade disputes that were begun under Donald Trump. So she has some problems to start with. Cecilia Rouse has been confirmed as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. That's not a name that most people know at all. She was the dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. So it seems as if she's very well qualified intellectually, and her background in labor economics will be a key experience as she helps the White House to navigate a path toward the coronavirus battered economy. Miguel Cardona was also confirmed, actually quite a few when I get to it, as Secretary of Education. And he was a teacher, a principal, a superintendent in Connecticut. So he's highly qualified to be Secretary of Education. And he is connected to the unions and can get along with them. Jennifer Granholm, who has been confirmed as Secretary of Energy. You may be familiar with her. She's a familiar face on CNN, I think. And she's a former 2-term governor of Michigan. and very experienced in dealing with the auto industry, as you might expect if she comes from Michigan. Let me see, I think I have a couple more. The Tom Vilsack, I've got it backwards. Tom Vilsack has been confirmed as Secretary of Agriculture. He was Secretary of Agriculture before, under the Obama administration. And Linda Thomas Greenfield has been confirmed as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. And she spent 35 years in the Foreign Service, including as an ambassador to Liberia and Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. And she has also spent time as a top human resource official at the State Department and could provide Biden valuable advice as he seeks to rebuild morale among U.S. diplomats who often felt cut out on the Trump administration because there were not diplomats running the State Department, etc. And thank you.
Excellent. Any questions about nominees or appointments?
Yes. What's the ratio or between women and men that have been? How many women, how many men?
Proportion of women and men, it's still about 70+% white male. And there are more black people and more, it's supposed to be the most diverse cabinet ever, but it's still approximately 70% white male.
I thought it was.
I'm not sure exactly how many women, but there are women in really important positions this time, extremely important positions. But I'm not sure what the exact proportion.
Lincoln.
Well, it's 30%.
Blinken, Anthony Blinken.
Anthony Blinken.
Secretary of State.
Yes.
Who's the Secretary of State?
Blinken.
Anthony Blinken.
Anthony Blinken. He was one of the first that was confirmed.
Yes.
He was one of the first people confirmed, and he's been working as Secretary of State.
Jim?
Are there any other nominees that have potential problems besides the loss of Neera Tanden?
Not so far.
I mean, it looks
I think
pretty
Deb
good,
Holland,
doesn't it?
Deb Holland was always considered the other marginal person, the first Native American. She was going to Interior.
Yeah.
Right.
But it looks like she'll make
it. It looks like she will be confirmed, and probably by Sarah too. The problem becomes if a Democrat doesn't want to vote for the person, then they have to try and find a Republican to replace the Democrat in the majority. And that was the problem with Neera Tanden, Joe Manchin from Virginia.
Something I'd like you perhaps to prepare for next week
Yes.
is how many
Yes, sir.
of these nominees have had Republican support.
How many Republicans?
How many of these nominees have had Republican support? Is this a
Oh,
straight party
I have how
line
many voted. I have how many voted for
in
each one.
favor of each of these people?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that next week, but I'm just
Okay.
curious to know if it's a more or less partisan split for these nominees.
No,
Than the
it's
past.
been very often about 60 some odd to 30 some
So
odd.
they're picking up
Yes, they're
10 or
picking up.
15.
But
yeah.
if a Democrat
Votes no, it's
does,
trouble.
does not want to be for somebody, then it's very difficult to get a Republican to replace that to be in the majority. But I have those.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
Debt deficit spending. I have to say a couple things. First of all, we wanted a UNF economics professor to come over and talk to us today, and the timing didn't work for the guy who'd agreed to do it. He'll come over. Chris Johnson's his name. He's talking about doing it sometime soon. So I'm going to start with a question. Are there any economists in the room? Any of you had that as a career, academically, first of all? And then I know Forrest, I know Neil were in the finance business, handling and managing large amounts of money. Are there any others with a financial background? Bankers or investment bankers? Well, then you two feel very free to correct things I say that are wrong.
I'm not touching that.
I'm going to try to wind this up in about this particular discussion about 25 or 30 minutes. The goal initially isn't to persuade anybody of any position one way or the other, but rather to raise some of the issues and explain them so that as we read the paper or listen to the news, we're better informed about what's being discussed. The topics of debt and deficit are certainly not new. The United States had a deficit, ran a deficit, and thus incurred debt in 1790. And at various times since then, we've been in more or less greater debt. More often than not, war has been the reason to incur large debt. Only fairly recently has that changed, and it's changed primarily due to three levels of spending. One of them related to war, being defense spending, the other two, health care and retirement care. And since those two both arose in the 30s, you can imagine that in the 150 years prior to that time, there wasn't a big discussion about debt and deficit. And of course, we didn't have an income tax until 1913, something like that. The debt, up until about 2007, ran about 35% of GDP. And there were times it was lower, oddly enough. Under Clinton, it was low. He balanced the budgets at 2 or 3 years during his administration. Debt went down as a percentage. Oddly, it went up as a percentage of GDP during Reagan and during both Bushes, father and son. In the case of the first Bush, it was part of that Reagan tax cut primarily that led to the increase in the debt. With the second Bush, it was the tax cut plus, of course, the spending in Iraq. Iraq, Afghanistan. I think things, generally speaking, prior to, let's say 2020, I mean, very, very recently, most of us thought about debt and deficit for the government in a way very similar to the way we think about it for our own households. You don't want to have a lot of debt. You certainly don't want to have a deficit, meaning you're spending more in a current period than you're taking in. It just doesn't make sense. Right? This is not rocket science. And it doesn't make sense at the level of the states, which is why virtually no state is allowed, I don't think any state, frankly, is allowed to operate at a deficit. States don't have that power because they can't print money. The federal government does have that capacity because, very simply, it has its own currency and can print money. There's a big difference between the United States printing money and most foreign countries. Can one of you explain, or anybody comment on why that is so? Doug.
Hang on to the microphone.
Well, the United States has the luxury of the United States dollar is essentially a world reserve currency. Up until about 1970 or something, like gold kind of fulfilled that role. And today the U.S. dollar. So as long as the other nations of the world feel comfortable holding U.S. dollars, that's a luxury that no other country has. China would like to replace us on that. I think the euro was designed with that goal in mind.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. I mean, I remember being operating in a couple of countries who started printing their own currency to deal with their deficit spending, and things only rapidly got worse. And that's a big difference and a big advantage for the United States. Still, up until 2010, the large majority of economists said, don't overspend. Manage the deficit, control the debt. What happened in 2010? I sent out a couple of heavy articles, one by Reinhardt and Rogoff, and I mention the names only in case you see them in the papers or hear them in the debate, that you'll relate to them. They wrote a paper in 2010 strongly advising governments not to run large debts. and that advice was variously accepted worldwide. What else happened in 2010 in this country of particular note? The Tea Party. And the Tea Party originally started off, as many of you know, as a debt and deficit advocacy group. We don't want to spend more than we take in. We don't want to run these crazy budgets. Sadly, I think other elements entered into the discussion with the Tea Party fairly early on. And that had something to do with the color of our president elected in 2008. We can debate that one way or the other, but strains of racial animosity arose then and continue to this day. From 2010 until 2020, the theory of no deficit spending, austerity living, prevailed. But in practice, in practice in many European countries, in fact, it was adopted. Particularly the attitude towards spending, say, in Greece. We read all about that for years. They've got to get their budget under control, otherwise we're not going to let them stay in the European Union. It was much easier for countries to look at other countries and say what they should do than to implement these policies themselves. But Germany, particularly, France and the UK a little less so, but still much more so than we, adopted austerity measures. We talked a good game, but the fact is that events sort of overtook that discussion. For Obama, the event was the 2008 financial collapse. It's very hard to implement an austerity program in the face of that kind of economic disaster. That was his biggest problem. His stimulus package to address that was limited to about 790, I think, $1 billion in that magnitude, 765, 785. And people give it credit for slowing the extent of the collapse, but they also say the recovery was slower because it was a smaller package than might otherwise have been the case. Again, I think probably Reinhardt and Rogoff would have questioned that. They would have said, no, just spend less, lower your deficit. And that led to the last 6 years of the 8-year Obama term being pretty austere, relatively speaking. That austerity went out the window, though, in 2016. And it went out the window in two fashions. The first was this very large tax cut promulgated by Trump in his first year, I guess, and by the large increase in defense spending. So we took in much less and put out much more. Duh. The debt went up. And it went up strikingly. Before 2006, let's say the beginning of the financial collapse, debt as a percentage of GDP was about 35%. When the Trump tax cut and defense spending hit, we rapidly moved toward 100%. We're now at about 107%. And as you all saw, thank you very much, the headline in USA Today said that by 2051, when most of us will be very concerned about that, I'm sure, the debt's going to hit 202%. Now, I think of GDP. I think anybody who forecasts out beyond about 6 months is in risky territory, but still, that's a frightening thing. And what it says is we have to make some changes if we're going to be concerned about the level of debt as a percentage of GDP. What they didn't say in the article, I haven't really read the article, I'll ask you, did they talk about a percentage of debt service relative to forecast income?
No, I didn't get into that detail. No.
And I'll explain why that's an important question. Rogoff and Reinhardt were both from Harvard and very ostensibly bright guys who said bright things. And they were followed by two other Harvard economists. President of Harvard, Larry Summers, and Jason Furman, who in 2020 took almost the opposite position from Rogoff and Reinhardt. And what they said, and it's nuanced, and it's something, if you have time to read it and you like these kind of things, you can read it slowly and carefully. But basically what they say is that look at interest rates. Why did we say we don't want high deficits? Well, because it leads to inflation. All right? Of course it does. Because it crowds out private borrowing. Of course it does. But it hasn't. And looking at that, the low level of interest rates, now for many of us, I'm sure you're in the same position that we've been, we only finally had 30 or 40 cents to rub together when the interest rates dropped from the 7% we'd counted on for retirement to 0. And I kept saying, it's not fair. You know? Whatever happened to inflation when you finally need it? But the fact of the matter is, interest rates have been at or near 0 for what now? 5 years? And that in the face of rapidly increasing deficit, rapidly increasing debt, huge deficits. And so Larry Summers, not a wild liberal, and I'll come to some comments about that in a second, and Furman and others, Blanchard, I mean the list of well-known economists is long, said, what's up with that? If in fact it's not crowding out private borrowers, and if it's not leading to inflation, why are we not spending that money in a way that makes sense? And that's the key sentence. Spending the money in a way that makes sense. The recent discussion about this has included another name, Jared Help. He's on the financial advisors. What's the first thing to go? Bernstein. Thank you, whoever said that. Jared Bernstein, who's on Biden's financial advisory group, and is very clearly a liberal, and he's been advising from the left for a long time now. Although, I don't know if you had a chance to read the Peterson Institute thing. It just lists a number of economists who share P. Peterson's view, or the Peterson Institute's view, which has always been really conservative. Peterson used to speak at the Council on Foreign Policy about the aging of America and how serious the problem we create by living longer and enjoying our retirement more. And somebody's going to have to finally pay the piper on this. It's all doom and gloom out there. And he lists, the Institute lists all these economists who share the view, don't let the deficit be large, don't let the debt grow out of control. And included on that list, Janet Yellen and Jared Bernstein and others who today are singing this new tune. What's the new tune? It basically says, and I'll try to just briefly summarize it from my notes. And by the way, I don't want to learn this much about anything again in my life, especially with no memory. I used to make it to the exam period. God. Now I can't even make it to breakfast. But good policy would be somewhere, basically spend more on smart things. Things that increase the productivity capability or productive capability of the country. Infrastructure, for example, good expenditure. And let the debt increase. Run a deficit for infrastructure. And this is now a growing number of economists. Education, not a bad way to spend money. Spend that beyond what you take in. Consumption, not so good. So if we examine the $1.9 trillion package that is, except for a few amendments, winding its way through Congress today, how much of that is infrastructure? Sadly none. A new infrastructure bill is now being talked about, and we can expect it soon, and it probably should enjoy strong support, except that when you stack it on top of the 1.9 trillion we've already spent, it's testing the credibility of this, allow the deficit to wander higher. That's a really major wandering. There is some education. in the present 1.9, but I think it's only around 160 billion, only 160 billion. But is the $1,400 primarily productive investment or consumption? Is the $400 a month extended unemployment benefit productive or consumption? The short answer is it's consumption. Now there is the traditional Keynesian argument that if more people consume, other people have to produce, and that increases or strengthens the economy. But it's not the same thing as an investment in something substantive that will pay off over a long period of time. It's sort of current production for current demand. I'm going to stop for a minute and ask for comments or observations on that. For those of you who understand all this stuff, where I'm a little long in my understanding, how we can amplify it. Forrest?
Bob, I love your,
Wait for it,
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Bob, I love your introductory remarks, even though I could argue on some of them, because one of the things that happens between administrations, one administration wants to do things that the previous administration or another party did not do, and it gets burdened either one way or the other, depending on what your goal is. So that thing always bothers me a little bit, because I'm sure that every new Democratic president has a list of things that the previous Republican didn't do, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And they equate stock performance to one or the other, when it probably started when I was nominated, because they anticipated the policy. So given that, I do think that there's just a fundamental insanity about this whole argument, because, and I made a comment last week about paper clips and $100 million bombers, for example,
Yeah.
which is a good asset if you're going to go to war, which I'd rather avoid. But I do think that there's just a lot of and it relates to something in this article by John Cassidy in the New Yorker about Rogoff and Reinhardt. And it makes a comment in here that I find a lot of argument with, but even his comments address it. He says, and this is on the third page or second page, I think, but he said, economics is a science. It proceeds via hypothesis and empirical testing, but it is soft and a squishy one. And any argument to the contrary should be treated with great suspicion. I honestly believe, with a lot of evidence, that economics is not a science. And the reason it's not a science is that participants think. So you can't say you put in this and this happens. And I think if you look at government spending in general, if they would just simply go to a capital budget for capital items and go for an operating budget for operating
It's
circumstances,
interesting. I like that contrast.
all of a sudden you get some sanity in it, because the average person that mortgages a home to buy it has a good asset, and they don't think as the debt is a horrible, no good thing. They probably, in many cases, especially with rates the way they are today, is a wonderful opportunity for them, and it will help people create assets or growth in their net worth. But the government just doesn't do that, and because of it, we end up with these endless conversations that lead to nowhere. I think, though, there is one example in the world that we all should look at. Japan has about 200 some odd percent, slightly over 200% of debt to GDP, and they couple that with an aging populace, and they don't allow much immigration. You put those three together, I would argue that if somebody could hold a position long enough, shorting the yen today would be a wonderful trade over time. But the U.S. is in a unique position. We're one of the younger countries in the world because we have immigration, which is an argument for it. But I think if you look at all those things together and get some thought instead of nonsense and debating about policies from a Democrat versus Republican standpoint, we can start to get some sense in this country. Right now, I think this country's on a dangerous path that there's no agreement, there's no thought, and it's just a bunch of nonsense.
There seems to be consensus there. Jim?
I just wondered if you're going to be weaving in it this particular discussion, the modern monetary theory that allows for this printing of money and continuing to spend more than we take in?
Well, I really thank you for bringing up the phrase, because I was looking for my notes on that. The MMT, modern monetary theory, is really the extreme position of the 2020 paper of Summers and the other guy. What I'm not persuaded, I mean, I can't understand the logic behind MMT. Can you elaborate on it, Jim, a little bit? Or is anybody here who knows the...
I don't know it that well, but it's this idea that because we are a sovereign nation with a valued currency that the world today is still accepting, we have the ability to print money and hopefully spend it on good things like infrastructure, but that we can go a lot deeper into debt because of this ability to fund these debts with our currency by just printing more money.
Yeah,
Yeah.
going short on the yen is a very, it's an obvious contrast. Japan is doing just that with problems worse than ours, but similar. And they can't print their currency on infinitum. Doug?
Couple of comments. First, on Japan, there's another fact that was not mentioned, and that is the Japanese people have a much higher savings rate than we as Americans do. So because the Japanese people are saving more, that means they're spending less on consumption. That means that you don't have the inflation. And if you don't have the inflation, that's what's kept this going in Japan. But cycling back to the United States with our debt. If we were to borrow money to, let's say years ago, we're buying a house, the bank is looking at how are we going to pay that off and what asset is securing that. With respect to the United States government, there isn't a program to pay it off. The answer is when that debt matures, it's going to be refinanced with more debt. So an additional risk that enters the calculation is what is the interest rate going to be when that debt is refinanced? And that's and you can just look at what's happening this year. Last week what interest rates were like, it's gone up 10 basis points just in 1 week. And so the market is expressing some concern with what the future interest rates are going to be.
But you wonder if, again, if you look at it as debt as a percentage of GDP, if it's productive investment, the debt can be high today, but if the GDP is growing faster, as a percentage of GDP, it's going to be lower. You wonder about the logic in this USA Today article. How did it get to be 202% of GDP? Did the CBO, who made that forecast, assume the static level of GDP or a slower growth level in GDP? They must be assuming slower growth in GDP than in debt.
Yes.
Or you wouldn't see that rapid percentage.
Also, briefly mentioned, Larry Summers has expressed some concern with this 1.9
No,
trillion.
he's an advocate of newer thinking, but certainly doesn't think we should spend money on consumption. Paul Krugman, radically, there were questions about the quality of his Nobel. A radical liberal economist is very concerned about the expenditures of non-productive investments. Just makes sense. I finally found the page about what I thought, as I read all this stuff, good policy is, and it's not MMT. The idea of an absolutely unfettered level of debt, that you can go as far as you want because we've got the currency to print. Just grates against my thinking, and my guess is virtually everyone here. Spending more than we have been spending for good purposes, that makes sense. Both makes sense individually, as it does as for the country. I do caution, though, and I'm going to go back to this, Doug. Wasn't the cause of the financial collapse in 2008 in part because people were spending on houses thinking, among other things, there's no end to what their value can grow to, and they over-leveraged their houses. Wasn't that a significant part of the collapse?
And the banks let them.
Yeah, and the banks in fact encouraged it because they got fees from doing so. So even there, the argument doesn't make sense. My ideas for good policy that I wrote down: it's important that we run a deficit because trying to balance the budget in the face of low interest rates is really counterproductive. But we should forget about national debt as a share of GDP and focus instead on debt servicing costs as a share of GDP. As long as we can service the debt at a rate that's lower than the growth rate, really the debt as a percentage of GDP should not grow. If that makes any sense.
Could I make one point?
Sure.
I think the government, the U.S. government today is missing a golden opportunity. Trump could have done it. I think Biden could do it. But it would be worthwhile for this country to extend the debt with the rates the way they are. Because the U.S. is capable of issuing a 100-year debt, which we've typically not done. But we could. Apple has issued a 100-year debt at less than 1%, I might add, when they did it. But the U.S. government, if they did that, some of the problems that Doug referred to a minute ago about what is a refinance rate, well, we wouldn't have to worry about it for a century. I think that's a missed opportunity if somebody doesn't do it.
That's very interesting. And I don't know does anybody have any idea why we don't do that? Maybe don't go 100, just roll it over 50 years.
Well, if they went 50, 75, and 100, I mean, they could do it. They could extend it for a long time at a very low rate. They haven't done it.
First thing you said that I sincerely agree with.
Well, I
Doug?
Now he's coming to the center finally.
like you long enough to become a Democrat.
Moving to
Doug?
the center.
Okay, actually, the United States Treasury Department does have an advisory board of people from the investment banking community that has looked at 50-year debt, has looked at 100-year debt,
Wow.
and has recommended against it.
Why? I wonder.
I don't.
Interest rates can't go lower than zero.
I think the concern is in what volumes could they issue? I don't know, but there is a committee that is not there. These are not government employees, but they work with the Treasury Department, and they did look at that issue of 50 and 100-year bonds.
I'd like to come back to that if we can find out the reasoning behind that, because it seems like intuitively it makes sense. I mean, if you borrow forever. The points that I listed, again, I've already said it, that use deficits to fund, to fuel growth. Physical infrastructure, human capital, repairing crumbling ports, falling bridges, fire-prone electrical systems, things like what happened in Texas. We could winterize all the grid facilities, just harden, not so much winterize, harden them against all forms of ultimate risk. Patchy broadband networks. There are so many opportunities to invest in productive stuff that it seems to me we should all get behind that. The thing to watch out for is whether borrowing costs are rising, whether budgetary allotment for payments on the debt is increasing, and whether we're spending on good priorities. Okay? So as this all continues to happen, and it's going to happen, I assume we're going to see another big spending package proposed by Biden in the next couple of weeks, actually. The infrastructure package will hit. I assume there's going to be a health care revision coming up fairly soon. I think we're going to see education spending increases. So we're going to have a lot of opportunity over the next few months to talk about rising deficits. My assumption is that what Biden learned most of all from the Obama-Biden experience in 2008 through 2010, get it done now.
Yep.
You're not going to have a majority after 2022. So don't count on that. Assume that 2022 is the end of all major legislation. And then from then on out, you're going to be running the thing. Forrest?
Bob, I hope one thing that he will learn from his previous
Obama administration and I've said it in here before, that Obama did not have any growth initiative in his 8 years in office. And I think there are plenty of opportunities to Biden to have growth initiatives that would encompass some and help offset some of this other initiatives.
Forrest, I heard you say that the other day in the table talk discussion. How do you define growth initiative in that? Tax cut?
Well, and I'll use Trump as an example. One reason we ramped up the growth rate in the economy during his early years is a huge tax cut. It worked. And you could say, well, it created a deficit. Yes, it did. But the Laffer curve also has often been proven correct. You may get a deferral initially, but you ultimately get more income with lower rates.
I'd like to table that one too, because I can make a pretty strong case that the rate of growth of the country and the economy during the last 6 years of Obama exceeded the growth rate during the Trump years, and was on a path to do so before Trump was elected. That what Trump took advantage of was the energy in that economy. Don't want to have that argument now. We're going to talk, oddly enough, about bias.
We can talk a long time about that.
Now let's change radically to the topic of bias. And since you've seen none of it here today, how many of you had a chance to read through the list of biases? Good. Anybody who didn't? Let's just go through them one at a time, and as we do so, feel free to talk about it a little bit. The first bias, and by the way, this came from a Richard Rohr article quoting from, and I think, Bob Nelson's on here.
Brian McLaren?
Maybe. No, it was so. Quoting from Brian McLaren's earlier work. Okay, but the list is something that we've seen elsewhere. It's not unique to McLaren or anybody else. Confirmation bias. We judge new ideas based on the ease with which they fit in with and confirm the only standard we have: old ideas, old information, and trusted authorities. As a result, our framing story, our belief system or paradigm excludes what doesn't fit. Comments? How many of you find yourselves doing this? First of all, I can't imagine any of us not doing that. I've been trying in the legacy group, and I'm trying to explore how my worldview, the bias which I'm trying to confirm, how it's changed over the years and what made it change. And what's odd for me is to find with the major changes in my life and what's going on around me, the world as well as my own experience of the world, as much as those changes occur, I keep coming back to the same positions, and I'm certain it's confirmation bias. Complexity bias. Our brains prefer a simple falsehood to a complex truth. It's like trying to understand this gibberish called economics. Don't spend more than you have. That makes a lot of sense to me. Community bias. It's almost impossible to see what our community doesn't, can't, or won't see. And that's an interesting one. If we're in a community of, say, Republicans or Democrats or white people in North America, it's hard to think like a brown-skinned person in Iraq or Iran. Complementarity bias. If you are hostile to my ideas, I'll be hostile to yours. If you're curious and respectful toward my ideas, I'll respond in kind. Makes a lot of sense to me. Competency bias. We don't know how much or little we know because we don't know how much or little others know. In other words, incompetent people assume that most other people are about as incompetent as they are. As a result, they underestimate their own incompetence and consider themselves at least of average competence. I love that one. I love that one. Consciousness bias. some things simply can't be seen from where I am right now, but if I keep growing, maturing, and developing, someday I will be able to see what is now inaccessible to me. This is something that McLaren and a lot of, Richard Rohr, particularly a lot of people, talk about all the time, which is that we are, as people and as individuals, moving through an hopefully upward path of consciousness. That we may start off, I think I may have talked about this once before, as infants, I am mouth, world is food. That's a pretty low level of consciousness. And then I become conscious of my mother, and I become conscious of the other. And as that happens, that expands my ability to relate, in fact, creates my ability to relate to others. And then if we continue through, the goal in some senses for some people, and I share it at least, as a goal, is non-dual consciousness. I don't deal in we, they, or I, you. I deal in us, and I accept the other as a part of my life. That's a higher level of consciousness than one that simply defines things my way. As consciousness increases, then clearly it opens up the possibility of broader bias. Does that make sense? Conservative or liberal bias. I lean toward nurturing fairness and kindness. Those are good things. I'm a liberal. Or strictly enforcing purity, loyalty, liberty, and authority, the bad things. I have no bias on that. That's a joke. But whoever wrote this, I'm reading it, I didn't make it up. Confidence bias. I'm attracted to confidence, even if it's false. I'm literally, when you listen to somebody talking, the assuredness with which they espouse a position informs whether or not you'll believe them so often. Gosh, he really seemed confident about that. Must be true. Catastrophe or normalcy bias. I remember dramatic catastrophes. This is important. But I don't notice gradual decline or improvement. Big events just sit longer in our biases. Contact bias. When I don't have intense and sustained personal contact with the other, my prejudices and false assumptions go unchallenged. I think that's important. And it's one of the things that argues so much for diversity. If we're only around people like us, we're going to think only about things the way people like us think. We never see the world differently and from different perspectives. Cash bias. This is pretty straightforward. It's hard for me to see something when my way of living requires me not to see it. And then finally, conspiracy bias. Under stress or shame, our brains are attracted to stories that relieve us, or exonerate us, or portray us as innocent victims of malicious conspirators. Charlie?
How many people in the room are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
I was just thinking of it.
Okay.
Elaborate.
Yeah, this briefly really says that all of us go through certain stages in our life. We have needs, and that you cannot get to a higher level of need until you have satisfied the one that you're currently at. For example, the lowest level of need is one of survival. You need food, we need shelter. Nothing else matters if you're at that stage, which, by the way, can vary across the globe in different times. The next level is one of security. Once you have these things, you don't want them taken away from you. You want to have a feeling of, this is good and I don't want to lose it. The next level becomes one of thinking about other people, and you want to be part of something. This is how we form a community versus living as a hermit up on the top of a mountain. The fourth one now is we're getting pretty good now. We've got pretty much what we need. Now we can look at the other people and say, hey, I'd like to have some recognition here because I've achieved something. And you get up to that fourth level, which means that I want friends and I want people to respect me. And the last level, if you've been able to accomplish all of these things, is that of self-actualization, meaning that you can be the best possible you. And this is when we go into individual things. We may become an artist, we may choose to, we may luckily a musician, but it's the things that really matter to us. But you can be at this level, and an atomic bomb hits. You know where you are? Right back at level number one. So these are an overriding sets of principles. They've been accepted in business, very much so. And I think it concerns, for our purposes of discussion, that we're aware of this as we move up in our life, particularly people who live here. We've accomplished quite a bit to be able to live here, but it can all go away in a flash.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that, to me, there are two risks. One of them is that we get stuck in an earlier level of consciousness or development. And we get stuck there because we're afraid to move up. We don't find community. I think that's the level between 3 and 4. Or we never think that we're capable of self-actualization, that we just don't have trust in our own, or confidence in our own ability to take that step. And stuck people probably also gravitate toward other stuck people. And then you have a community at a low and less effective level of capability. Neil?
There is a concept of the debt rising beyond our imagination, and it's called debasement of our currency. In fact, I believe our currency is being debased as we increase the debt. And the signs of that tend to be things like the rise in gold, silver, the mania over Bitcoin, and other such things as that. They're all indicative of the debasement of the currency of this country as we increase our debt. Not sure where I come out on at what point do we discontinue the increase of debt, but it probably will focus on where we're spending our newly minted money in productive ways as opposed to consumption. I have no real strong understanding of the trade-off between those two, but we are debasing our U.S. dollar.
There's a bias there, I know.
Let me say a few other things. We are seeing a flight to Bitcoin.
I was just going to say, if you're a
Some of the
Bitcoin
smartest
owner,
minds, so they think. Some of the biggest hedge funds, et cetera, are buying billions and billions and billions of dollars of Bitcoin. Who understands Bitcoin in this room? Very few people, including me. And I've been sort of toying around with getting a small stake in something called Ethereum and just having it to watch what happens to it as a guide or a measurement of where we're going. But I maintain we're debasing the dollar as we increase the debt.
well, I like the idea of you buying and are watching you.
What was that in here?
I like the idea that you risk your money and we'll watch. Report back.
Tell us how it goes.
$10,000 is not going to be risking very much money.
Well said, well said. Is it called a Sarkozy or something like that? Is that the little
Something
bit?
like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think one thing that's important in this discussion, and that triggers a thought,
Is the fact that the Fed has got as a stated policy that we're working with in this political world is the 2% inflation rate is in fact putting the stamp of approval of the government on debasement of the currency on an annual basis.
By accepting 2% as normal.
Absolutely. It is debasement.
I want to go back to all your biases here. And
Flexibility, by the way, is a mark of great wit.
I guess as I was going through that list that you sent out, really, these are barriers to getting to a solution. And I was thinking of doing an end run around the whole thing.
I like that.
And to me, the starting point is, what problem are we looking to find a solution for? And if we, for example, if the problem is we have people, too many people that are 18, 19, 20 years old that have not been properly educated, well, then we have a problem. And I think that will attract people from all walks of this political spectrum to looking for a solution. A couple thoughts on one of your comments was on diversity, which I'm going to on the top line, I'm going to strongly agree with that. Because if you're responsible for trying to solve a problem, you want as many ideas as possible or as many angles of view. But I would look for diversity of opinion, diversity of experience, as opposed to maybe more visible characteristics of diversity.
Okay, I totally agree with that. I do think, though, that ethnic and racial differences are hugely important, and exposure to those differences just makes so much sense. In part because those are growing populations in our country. Don?
That brings up a point, it seems to me. The actual importance of difference between us, we people. We concentrate, it seems to me, on the fact that this person or this group of people are different than my group of people, rather than how can we get together? How do we solve that problem? Why is the person sitting over here who's got black skin is different than me? It really isn't. I mean, it's about, what do they say, 93, 96% of the DNA of all of us is the same. But there are differences. And the average person doesn't sit in this room, frankly. The average person is out there maybe marching on the Capitol, but even those, I'm not sure, are the average people. It's a level even below that don't live in this, I don't think, I should say, in this concept of these very valid arguments, but they live day to day in their little world, and that's how they think. That's how they react to what's going on around them.
Well said. One of the reasons that this all is intriguing me is that I remember there was a conversation we were having in here about whether the argument is a Democratic idea or a Republican idea, as opposed to just saying it's an idea we want to examine. So much of what goes on in our lives has no color, red or blue. And somehow in today's world, Charles, we'll come back to in just a second, we've allowed color, not black and white, but red or blue, to enter into every discussion. I can't imagine there's a policy that really is 100% Democrat or 100% Republican. They don't exist. And yet votes often reflect that. Charlie?
How many times have we heard a politician talk about the American people want this, the American people want that, we want this inclusion of everybody thinking the way this particular politician is talking. It could be other people as well. We assume that there's I don't know who these people are, but the assumption is they all think the way, that all the American people think the same way.
Well, one thing that's very clear, and I think this underscores what Don is saying, is that we can assume that average Americans aren't sitting around a room at 10 o'clock in the morning talking about current events. This is a real luxury, a luxury that comes of age and of our lives, and it's a valuable luxury. We've come, believe it or not, no, we're not at the end. We have time for more. Neil?
Hold on for your wife.
And I love listening to Neil because it can come from anywhere.
I just want to make one comment on the gentleman who's mentioned 2% as a normal inflationary index. If I'm not mistaken, we've been told here in this facility that they are predicting 4% or more increase in all of our expenses. So the world we live in is rising on cost basis twice the normal accepted. In fact, if it's 2%, it's 4% or better here, and that's what you're looking at.
Which is, that I think reflects the fact that this is working. We're living longer.
Well, I'm not criticizing you.
No, I know, but it's part of me wants to say, come on, somebody drop this. It's costing too much. I didn't say that.
Okay, well, on inflation indexes, these are the consumer price indexes, the 2%. With respect to here, labor costs are a greater percentage than in the consumer price index. And of course, looking at the labor costs going up more than 2%, we can understand that. And then secondly would be medical expenses, which are going up even more than that, both because of the medical advances and basically the additional consumption of medical services that were not previously available.
And as I understand it, we're not yet at a $15 a year or an hour floor here at Vickers. Most of the staff is paid significantly less than that. And if and when a $15 minimum is promulgated, we can expect that 4% to, at least in that initial period, to be significantly higher. And I have to say, I don't say this because a high rate of cost increase here is casual. It's not. But I really do have a lot of sympathy for anybody earning $7 or $8 an hour trying to take care of a family. It just doesn't happen. And that doesn't sit well with my sense of things. I think one of the ideas, Charlie mentioned this in the corridor earlier, I think the issues of the bias and stages of consciousness or Maslow level would make a good table discussion. In the Catholic Church where I go, I lecture sometimes, and I always begin, or not because it's my idea, we were told in the beginning of things, now everyone please take a moment to silence your cell phone.
Yeah, we're gonna have to
That's
start doing
okay.
that.
I'm not making fun of you, Charlie. It's happened 3 or 4 times, but it might be a good idea. Anyway, think about that as a table talk thing. And I think it might be something that lends to very good discussions at table. Any other comments, questions, or suggestions?
What's next week? We'll have to see what happens here.
Frank?
Let's get back to current events on the COVID-19 bill. What percentage of it goes to COVID relief and what percent goes to bailing out bankrupt cities? If you remember, Nancy Pelosi said we got to pass this bill to see what's in it. When are we going to find out about the COVID-19?
Well, you may have noticed this morning, the good news is that, this isn't a direct answer to your question, but 2 of the changes that were agreed last night in the Senate bill that's going to be voted on when this vote-a-rama is over, address that specifically. There's a cap on how much, no, there's not a cap, there's an absolute, none of the money can be used to pay back bonds, city bonds that were issued. And there's a second one that's a cap on expenditures for municipalities. They're really trying to specifically address the concept of bailing out failed cities or failed states.
Are they going back to earmarks?
Well, there's talk about that, and that's another one of those conversations that it is too late. I think we ought to talk about earmarks and whether they made sense or not in earlier administrations. One of the things I personally liked about earmarks, I don't like the under-the-table things and slipping in things that were filled with graft, but I do like the idea of congressmen and women and senators doing something for their people. And knowing that this is my constituency, I need to support things for my constituency. And somewhere in the discussion of earmarks, I think we can talk about those 2 things. But the answer is yes. Both Democrats and Republicans are now talking about bringing them back.
Well, you do know that Congress works 3 days a week. And the 3 days they're in there, they're on the phone raising funds for their next election.
I was going to question your use of the word work. But
Depends on your bias.
thank you all very much. Next Friday at 10 o'clock. And we'll decide what we're going to talk about based on what's current. How about that?
Great, that's what it's all about.